Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Marcus Chen didn't believe in ghosts. Not even when his running partner swore she'd seen something on Lugard Road the week before. He'd laughed it off, chalked it up to exhaustion or the morning mist playing tricks on her eyes. But that was before his own run, before the woman in white appeared beside him on the narrow trail, moving in perfect silence despite the gravel beneath what should have been her feet. She kept pace with him for nearly 30 seconds, her wedding dress pristine in the dim pre-dawn light, her face turned away as if admiring the view of the harbor below. When Marcus finally gathered the courage to glance directly at her, to ask if she was all right, she was gone. Not running ahead, not fallen behind, just completely absent from the trail, as though she had never existed at all. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stopped, turning in a slow circle, searching the empty path for any sign of movement. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the distant hum of traffic beginning to build in the city far below. Marcus had moved to Hong Kong 6 months earlier for work, trading the flat sprawl of Toronto for the vertical intensity of one of the world's densest cities. His company had placed him in mid-levels, halfway up Victoria Peak, in a cramped but expensive apartment that offered a sliver view of the harbor if he pressed his face against the living room window at the right angle. The adjustment had been harder than he'd expected. The humidity clung to his skin like a second layer. The crowds pressed in from all sides, and the language barrier left him feeling constantly off balance despite his basic Cantonese lessons. Running became his escape, his way of carving out a small piece of control in a city that felt overwhelming. He discovered Lugard Road within his first month, a peaceful loop around the peak that offered stunning views and relatively cool air in the early morning hours before the heat settled in. The trail was popular with expatriates and locals alike, though at 5:30 in the morning, Marcus usually had it mostly to himself. He liked it that way, preferred the solitude and the rhythm of his footfalls on the packed earth and stone pathway. The trail itself was historic, built during the colonial era and named after a British governor, winding through dense vegetation that occasionally opened up to reveal breathtaking panoramas of the city below. Marcus had never been superstitious, had never paid much attention to the ghost stories that seemed to pepper every corner of Asian cities. His colleagues at the office loved to share tales during lunch breaks, speaking in hushed tones about haunted buildings and restless spirits. But Marcus had always attributed it to cultural differences, a fondness for folklore that he simply didn't share. His running partner, Jennifer, was a fellow Canadian who'd been in Hong Kong for 3 years. She'd been the one to introduce him to Lugard Road, and she'd been the one to warn him about the woman in white just a week ago. They'd been stretching after a morning run when she mentioned it, her voice casual but her eyes serious, watching his reaction carefully. A woman in a wedding dress, she'd said, appearing out of nowhere near the bend by the old pillbox, keeping pace with her for what felt like minutes before vanishing the moment Jennifer tried to speak to her. Marcus had smiled, made a joke about too much caffeine before dawn runs, and Jennifer had let it drop, though he'd noticed the slight tightness around her mouth that suggested she wasn't amused. Now, standing alone on the trail with his pulse still racing from more than just exertion, Marcus felt the first cold thread of doubt work its way into his certainty. He'd seen her clearly, impossibly clearly given the dim light and the speed they'd both been moving. The wedding dress had been elaborate, something from another era entirely, with long sleeves and a high collar, the fabric somehow luminous against the dark foliage. Her hair had been pinned up in an intricate style, dark and glossy, with what looked like flowers woven through it. She'd been young, he thought, though he hadn't seen her face clearly. Asian, certainly, and moving with an odd kind of grace that didn't quite match the rough terrain of the trail. Marcus pulled out his phone, checking the time. 5:47. He'd been running for barely 20 minutes, had barely made it a third of the way around the loop. The sky was lighter now, the city below beginning to sharpen into focus as the sun crept toward the horizon. He could turn back, call it a morning, head home and pretend this hadn't happened. Or he could continue, prove to himself that there was a rational explanation. Maybe someone was filming something nearby, a student project or a low-budget horror movie. Maybe it had been a real person in costume, someone playing a prank or practicing for some kind of performance. The explanations sounded thin even in his own mind, but Marcus forced himself to start running again, slower now, his eyes scanning the trail ahead and the vegetation on either side. The path narrowed as it curved around the peak, stone walls rising on one side and a steep drop on the other protected only by a low railing. This was the section where Jennifer said she'd seen the woman, near the old World War II pillbox that sat like a concrete ghost itself among the trees. Marcus approached it cautiously, his footsteps deliberately loud on the gravel, as if noise might ward off whatever he'd seen. The pillbox loomed gray and silent, covered in graffiti and vines, its narrow openings dark and uninviting. Nothing moved in the shadows. No figure in white materialized from the morning mist. Marcus paused beside it, his rational mind reasserting itself. He'd been tired, had skipped breakfast, probably was slightly dehydrated. The mind could play tricks under those conditions, could conjure images from suggestions planted by Jennifer's story. He was about to continue when he noticed something on the railing just ahead, near the spot where the trail curved sharply and the view opened up to show Kowloon sprawling across the harbor. Something white, fluttering slightly in the breeze that had picked up as dawn approached. Marcus walked toward it slowly, his stomach tightening with each step. It was fabric, he realized, a strip of white silk caught on the metal railing, fluttering like a trapped bird. The material was old. He could tell that immediately. Aged and delicate, in a way that suggested decades rather than days. He reached out carefully, touching it with just his fingertips. It was real, solid, not a hallucination or a trick of the light. The silk was embroidered with tiny flowers, the stitching intricate and done by hand, the kind of work that belonged to another era entirely. Marcus looked over the railing, down the steep slope that dropped away into dense vegetation, and eventually the roads far below. How far down was it? 50 feet? 100? Impossible to tell in the tangle of trees and undergrowth. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening the browser, searching for information about Lugard Road, about accidents, about the ghost stories that apparently everyone but him had known about. The results came up immediately. Dozens of forum posts and blog entries, and even a few news articles from years past. The woman in white, the bride of Lugard Road, one of Hong Kong's most persistent ghost stories. The details varied depending on the source, but the core narrative remained consistent. A young woman, a bride, had been taking wedding photos along the scenic trail sometime in the 1950s or 60s, the exact year lost to time and embellishment. She'd been posing near the railing, her new husband and the photographer urging her closer to the edge to capture the dramatic backdrop of the harbor. She'd stepped back, lost her footing, and fallen. Some versions said she died instantly, her neck broken on the rocks below. Others claimed she'd survived long enough to call out for help that never came, bleeding out alone in the undergrowth while her wedding party searched frantically above. The ghost was said to appear to runners and hikers, always in the early morning hours, always wearing her wedding dress, always moving silently along the trail before vanishing near the spot where she'd fallen. Some people reported feeling a cold presence. Others claimed to hear weeping carried on the wind. A few said she'd spoken to them, asking in Cantonese if they'd seen her husband, if they knew the way back to the church. Marcus felt his skin prickle despite the growing warmth of the morning. He looked at the strip of silk still caught on the railing, then back at his phone screen. One article mentioned that items had been found over the years, small pieces of fabric, a hairpin once, offerings left by the railing by people who believed in the story and wanted to honor the dead woman. The author speculated that some of it was genuine, remnants somehow preserved in the Hong Kong climate, while other pieces were likely left by believers or pranksters adding to the legend. The sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the trail with golden light, and the sudden warmth on Marcus's face felt like permission to move again. He carefully untangled the silk from the railing, folding it into a small square that he tucked into the pocket of his running shorts. He didn't know why he took it, didn't want to examine the impulse too closely. Maybe as proof, maybe as a way to process what he'd seen, or maybe because leaving it there felt wrong somehow, disrespectful. He continued his run, faster now, eager to complete the loop and get back to the familiar territory of his apartment building. The rest of the trail passed without incident, other joggers beginning to appear as the city woke up, their presence reassuring in its normalcy. By the time Marcus reached his building, he'd almost convinced himself that the panic had been overblown, that there was still a rational explanation waiting to be discovered. He showered, dressed for work, made coffee, going through the motions of his morning routine. The strip of silk sat on his dresser where he'd emptied his pockets, a small white accusation against the dark wood. At the office, Marcus found himself distracted, his mind returning again and again to those 30 seconds on the trail. During lunch, he mentioned it casually to Jennifer, trying to sound amused rather than unsettled. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, her face pale. She'd seen the woman 3 times now, she admitted, not just the once she'd mentioned. Each time had been more disturbing than the last, the figure staying closer, visible for longer periods. The most recent encounter, just 2 days ago, the woman had turned to look at her directly, and Jennifer had seen her face for the first time. It was young, beautiful, and completely expressionless, empty in a way that Jennifer struggled to describe. Not sad, not angry, just void, as if whatever had animated the person was long gone, and only the image remained. Jennifer had stopped running on Lugard Road after that, had switched to the gym treadmill, despite hating indoor running. She begged Marcus to do the same, to let it go, to find another route. But Marcus found himself resistant to the idea, found himself planning to return the next morning, even as some deeper part of him recoiled at the thought. He went back to Lugard Road the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each morning he left his apartment in the dark, his heart rate already elevated before he'd taken a single running step, anticipation and dread mixing into something he couldn't quite name. The woman appeared each time, always near the same stretch of trail, always in her wedding dress, always moving in that uncanny silence. She never turned toward him anymore, never acknowledged his presence, but he felt watched nonetheless, felt her awareness of him even when her face remained averted. Marcus began to research obsessively, spending his evenings diving deeper into the story, finding variations and details that hadn't appeared in the initial search results. One blog post mentioned that the woman's name might have been Susan, or Su Lin, the author uncertain about the transliteration from Cantonese. Another claimed her husband had been a British colonial officer, that the marriage had been controversial, that her family had opposed it. There were rumors that it hadn't been an accident at all, that she'd jumped deliberately, unable to face the shame of her choice or perhaps forced into the marriage against her will. Other versions suggested the husband had pushed her, that he'd been abusive, that the wedding photos had been an attempt to present a happy facade while hiding a darker truth. Marcus found himself drawn to the memorial websites and forums where people discussed Hong Kong's ghost stories, reading through hundreds of accounts from people who claimed encounters with the Bride of Lugard Road. Some seemed obviously fabricated, too detailed and dramatic to be believable. Others had a ring of authenticity, describing the same details Marcus had witnessed, the same locations, the same sense of wrongness that accompanied the sightings. He found photos, too, old ones, allegedly from the 1950s, showing a beautiful young Chinese woman in a white wedding dress, standing near a harbor view. The captions claimed this was Susan, the ghost herself, photographed on the day she died. But the image quality was poor and the provenance questionable, and Marcus couldn't be sure if he was looking at evidence or simply another layer of mythology. His colleagues at work began to notice his distraction, his manager gently suggesting he take a few days off if he was feeling unwell. Marcus assured them he was fine, but he could see the concern in their eyes, could feel himself becoming the subject of whispered conversations when he left the room. On the 7th morning, everything changed. Marcus reached the familiar bend near the pillbox, his breathing controlled despite his increased pace, and found the woman waiting rather than appearing mid-stride. She stood directly in the center of the trail, her back to him, facing the railing and the view beyond. For the first time, Marcus stopped running before reaching her, coming to a halt about 10 feet away. His throat felt tight, his mouth dry. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to stop this dangerous game he'd been playing. But he couldn't move, couldn't look away. The woman's wedding dress was even more elaborate, up close, covered in embroidery and beadwork that must have taken months to complete. Her hair was perfectly arranged despite what should have been years or decades in the grave, or wherever ghosts resided when they weren't haunting trails on Victoria Peak. Marcus tried to speak, managed only a rough croak that sounded pathetic even to his own ears. He cleared his throat, tried again. He asked if she was all right, the question absurd under the circumstances, but the only thing his shocked mind could formulate. The woman didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the question in any way. But she moved, taking a single step toward the railing, then another. Marcus watched, paralyzed, as she reached the barrier and placed her hands on it, her posture that of someone admiring a view or perhaps gathering courage. He took a step forward without meaning to, some instinct to prevent what seemed about to happen, overriding his fear. The woman turned her head then, not her body, just her head, rotating in a way that seemed to involve too many degrees, too much range of motion. Marcus saw her face for the first time, really saw it, and Jennifer's description hadn't done justice to the horror of it. She was beautiful, that part was true, with delicate features and smooth skin, but the emptiness was absolute, as if he were looking at a photograph of a face rather than a face itself, two-dimensional despite its three-dimensional presence. Her eyes were the worst part, dark and depthless, containing nothing that resembled consciousness or awareness or any quality that might be called human. She looked at him, through him, beyond him, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This wasn't a hallucination, wasn't a person in costume, wasn't anything that fit into the categories his rational mind had built over 32 years of life. This was something else entirely, something that existed in defiance of everything he thought he knew about death and consciousness and the boundaries between past and present. The woman turned away, again, her attention returning to the view, and Marcus found he could move once more. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to put distance between himself and the figure at the railing. She didn't pursue, didn't even turn to watch him go. She simply stood there, a bride frozen in the moment before her death, or perhaps in the endless moment after it, trapped in a loop that played out morning after morning for anyone unfortunate or foolish enough to witness it. Marcus ran then, really ran, pushing himself harder than he ever had, his legs burning and his lungs screaming as he raced back toward the trailhead and the comforting noise and crowds of the waking city. He didn't look back, couldn't look back, terrified of what he might see following him down the path. He reached his apartment building in record time, burst through the lobby past a startled security guard, and didn't stop until he was inside his unit, with the door locked and bolted behind him. He stood in his tiny living room, chest heaving, and pulled out his phone with shaking hands. The strip of silk was still on his dresser where he'd left it days ago. He should throw it away, he thought. Should get rid of any connection to what he'd seen. But something stopped him. Some feeling that disposing of it would be worse somehow, more dangerous. Instead, he found himself researching what you were supposed to do with haunted objects, stumbling across websites about cleansing and blessing and proper disposal rituals that seemed to belong to a different world entirely from the one he'd inhabited just a week ago. In the end, he took the silk to a small temple he'd passed dozens of times without really noticing, tucked into a narrow street in Shungwan. An elderly woman accepted it without question, nodding gravely when Marcus tried to explain where it had come from in his broken Cantonese. She assured him it would be handled properly, blessed and burned with the appropriate ceremonies, and asked if he wanted the same done for himself, some ritual to cleanse him of whatever attachment he might have formed. Marcus declined, paid a small donation, and left feeling somehow lighter but not comforted. He never ran on Lugard Road again, switching to the waterfront promenade in Simshat Sui, where the crowds and noise provided a different kind of safety. Jennifer was relieved when he told her, admitted that she'd been worried he was becoming obsessed, that she'd considered calling someone from the company's employee assistance program. Marcus tried to return to normal, to focus on work and the everyday challenges of expat life, but something had fundamentally changed. He found himself more aware of the city's ghost stories, more attentive when colleagues shared tales during lunch breaks. He started noticing the small shrines tucked into corners of buildings, the offerings left at the bases of old trees, the burned paper money and incense that marked places where the boundary between the living and dead seemed thinner than usual. Hong Kong, he realized, was a city built on layers of history and tragedy, each generation adding to the accumulated weight of unresolved deaths and unfinished business. The Bride of Lugard Road was just one story among thousands, one ghost among a multitude that supposedly haunted the streets and buildings and trails of this densely packed territory. Marcus began to understand why the locals took these stories seriously, why they performed rituals and made offerings, and treated the spirit world with a respect that he'd initially dismissed as superstition. 3 months after his last encounter on the trail, Marcus was transferred back to Toronto, his company consolidating operations and closing the Hong Kong office. He was relieved to leave, though he felt guilty about the relief, as if running away from something he should have confronted more directly. On his last night in the city, he took the tram up to Victoria Peak one final time, standing at the viewing platform as the sun set and the city lights began to sparkle below. He didn't walk on Lugard Road, didn't even look in that direction. But he thought about the woman in white, wondered if she was still there, still walking her endless loop, still searching for something lost more than half a century ago. He hoped someone would find her story eventually, discover her real name and what had really happened on that long-ago day, give her the recognition and perhaps the peace that might free her from the trail. But he suspected that was naive, that some ghosts remained precisely because the truth had been lost, because no one living remembered enough to set the record straight. The city swallowed stories as efficiently as it swallowed lives, building over the past without pausing to acknowledge what lay beneath. Marcus flew home the next morning, leaving behind the humidity and crowds and vertical intensity of Hong Kong. But he took something with him, too, some small crack in the certainty he'd once felt about the nature of reality, some understanding that the world contained more than what his rational mind could comfortably accept. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as unsettling as the Bride of Lugard Road remains, Hong Kong harbors darker tales still, stories written not in silk and flowers but in stone and shadow. During the chaos of war, ordinary places became theaters of unimaginable suffering, and some of that anguish, it seems, never truly left. What happens when hundreds of desperate souls vanish into darkness, seeking shelter that becomes a tomb? The answer lies beneath the streets of Kowloon, in a tunnel that was meant to carry trains, but instead bore witness to something far more terrible, something that even now refuses to be forgotten. Sarah Leung had driven through Kings Park Tunnel hundreds of times since getting her license 3 years ago, never once feeling anything but mild annoyance at the traffic that often clogged the short passage beneath Kowloon's dense residential neighborhoods. It was just a tunnel, one of many that threaded through Hong Kong's mountainous terrain, connecting one district to another with efficient urban planning that prioritized flow over aesthetics. The tunnel itself was unremarkable, a stretch of concrete and tile lit by harsh fluorescent lights, usually traversed in less than 2 minutes, unless traffic backed up during rush hour. Sarah used it, regularly on her commute from her family's apartment in Mongkok to her job at a marketing firm in Tsim Sha Tsui, barely registering the transition from daylight to artificial light and back again. She was practical by nature, focused on the tangible concerns of her 26-year-old life, career advancement and relationship troubles, and whether she could afford to move out of her parents' place sometime before she turned 30. Ghosts and spirits were things her grandmother believed in, part of an older generation's worldview that didn't quite fit with Sarah's modern, internationally educated perspective. She'd grown up in Hong Kong, but had spent 4 years at university in Australia, returning with a degree in communications and a slightly outsider's view of her own city's traditions and superstitions. She burned incense at her grandmother's insistence during important festivals and avoided certain numbers when choosing apartment floors. But these felt more like cultural habits than genuine beliefs, rituals performed to maintain family harmony, rather than to appease any actual supernatural forces. That changed on a Tuesday night in late October, when Sarah left work later than usual, staying behind to finish a presentation that was due the next morning. The office had emptied out by 8, her colleagues heading home or to dinner or to the bars and restaurants that made Hong Kong's nightlife so vibrant. Sarah had worked in focused silence for another 2 hours, finally saving her files and shutting down her computer at 10:15, later than she'd intended but satisfied with what she'd accomplished. The streets were still busy when she emerged from her building, Hong Kong's famous energy undimmed by the late hour, tourists and locals mixing on the crowded sidewalks, neon signs blazing in Chinese and English. Sarah walked to the parking garage, where she kept her small Honda, a 10th birthday present from her parents, who'd wanted her to have reliable transportation in a city where public transit, despite its excellence, didn't reach everywhere conveniently. She'd named the car Betsy, a silly English name that made her smile, and had decorated the interior with a small stuffed bear dangling from the rearview mirror, and a jasmine air freshener that fought a constant battle against Hong Kong's humidity. The drive home would take about 20 minutes at this hour, the traffic lighter than during the day, but never completely absent in a city of 7 million people. Sarah navigated out of the garage and onto Nathan Road, heading north toward Kings Park Tunnel and the familiar route back to Mongkok. The radio played cantopop, some new singer her younger sister had been obsessing over, and Sarah hummed along despite not knowing the words, feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from productive work. She barely noticed when she entered the tunnel, her hands adjusting the steering wheel automatically to follow the slight curve, her eyes tracking the car ahead to maintain proper distance. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, something Sarah vaguely registered as unusual but not particularly concerning. Power fluctuations happened, especially in older infrastructure, and Kings Park Tunnel had been built decades ago, part of the underground rail system before being converted to road use. She was perhaps a third of the way through when her headlights dimmed, the bright beams suddenly reduced to a weak yellow glow that barely illuminated the road ahead. Sarah frowned, tapping the control stalk, wondering if she'd accidentally switched to parking lights, but the control was in the correct position, and the lights didn't respond to her manipulation. Strange, she thought, making a mental note to have the car checked, possibly an electrical issue that needed attention before it became a real problem. Then the dashboard lights flickered and died, all the glowing indicators and displays going dark simultaneously. The radio cut out mid-song, the sudden silence loud in its own way. Sarah felt the first flutter of concern, her hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly. The car was still moving, the engine still running, but something was clearly wrong. She eased off the accelerator, planning to pull over once she exited the tunnel, not wanting to stop in the enclosed space where other cars might not see her in time. The vehicle ahead of her was having similar problems, she noticed, its taillights dimming to almost nothing, brake lights barely visible when the driver slowed. Behind her, she could see in the rearview mirror that the car following had also lost its headlight strength, all of them suddenly struggling with the same mysterious electrical failure. The tunnel's fluorescent lights flickered again, more pronounced this time, sections of them going completely dark for 2 or 3 seconds before struggling back to life. In those moments of darkness, Sarah felt something shift in the atmosphere, some quality of the air or pressure or temperature, changing in a way she couldn't quite define, but felt viscerally. The pleasant tiredness from moments ago was gone, replaced by a growing unease that tightened her chest and quickened her heartbeat. She told herself it was just the unexpected situation, the minor car trouble combined with the flickering lights, creating a sense of unease that wasn't justified by the actual level of danger. She'd exit the tunnel in less than a minute, pull over safely, and call her father, who'd know whether she could drive home or needed a tow truck. But even as she tried to rationalize, Sarah found her eyes drawn to the tunnel walls, to the shadows that seemed darker and more substantial than they should be in the weak remaining light. The tiles were old, she noticed for the first time, stained and cracked in places, some sections covered in what might have been water damage or mold. Graffiti marked various spots, Chinese characters and English words that she couldn't quite make out in the poor visibility. And there, near the base of the wall where it met the road, something that looked almost like handprints, dozens of them, palm marks pressed against the concrete, as if people had been leaning heavily or trying to climb. Sarah's rational mind supplied an explanation. Maintenance workers over the years leaving marks from dirty hands. Nothing unusual about that. But the unease kept growing, kept insisting that something about those prints was wrong. that their placement and number suggested something other than casual workplace grime. The temperature dropped, suddenly and significantly, cold enough that Sarah's breath became visible in the weak dashboard light that flickered intermittently back to life. She reached for the climate control, wondering if the air conditioning had malfunctioned along with everything else, blasting cold air for some reason. But the controls were dead, unresponsive to her touch, and, besides, the cold didn't feel like air conditioning. It felt older somehow, damper, carrying with it a smell that made Sarah's stomach clench. Decay, she thought, or something that had been closed up too long without air circulation, organic matter breaking down in darkness. The car ahead of her had slowed to barely above a crawl, the driver apparently as disturbed by the situation as Sarah felt. She slowed as well, maintaining distance, her eyes now fully adjusted to the dimness and seeing details she wished she couldn't. The walls weren't just marked with handprints, she realized. There were scratches, too, long gouges in the concrete as if made by fingernails, clusters of them at various heights, some down near the floor and others stretching up higher than a person could easily reach. Sarah tried not to look, tried to focus on the road ahead and the promise of daylight that had to be coming soon, but her eyes kept being drawn back to the walls, kept finding new disturbing details. There were darker stains, too, discolored patches that could have been water damage, but looked uncomfortably organic, rust-colored and spreading in patterns that suggested splatter rather than seepage. The rational explanations were getting harder to maintain, her mind struggling to construct innocent reasons for what she was seeing. Traffic, she noticed suddenly, had stopped entirely. The car ahead was motionless, its weak taillights glowing like dying embers. Sarah hit her brakes, stopping with several feet to spare, and checked her rear-view mirror. The car behind her had also stopped, and beyond it she could see other vehicles stretching back into the darkness, all of them still, all of them with failing lights, trapped in the tunnel like insects in amber. Sarah's heart was racing now, genuine fear replacing unease. This wasn't just a minor electrical problem, wasn't something that could be explained by coincidence or aging infrastructure. Something was actively wrong, something was happening that violated the normal rules of how cities and cars and tunnels were supposed to function. She pulled out her phone, intending to call for help, but the screen remained black despite her pressing the power button repeatedly. Dead. Completely dead, even though she'd charged it fully before leaving the office, and it had been working fine just minutes ago. Outside her window, barely visible in the dying light, Sarah saw movement. Not another car, not another driver getting out to investigate the strange situation, but something else, something that shifted in the shadows near the tunnel wall with a fluidity that didn't match human movement. She told herself it was a trick of the light, shadows cast by the flickering fluorescence, creating an illusion of motion where none existed. But the movement continued, became more distinct, resolved into something that Sarah's mind initially refused to accept as real. There were people standing against the wall, dozens of them maybe, hundreds, pressed so tightly together that they formed an almost solid mass of humanity. They were pale, almost luminous in the darkness, their clothing strange and old-fashioned, the kind of simple tunics and pants that belonged to another era entirely. Their faces were turned toward the cars, toward Sarah, and even through the distorting veil of fear and weak light, she could see their expressions. Desperation, terror, pleading, all of it frozen in place as if they died experiencing those emotions and remained locked in that final moment. Sarah's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. She wanted to close her eyes, wanted to look away, but she found she couldn't, found herself trapped by the sight of those faces, by the terrible understanding that was forcing its way into her consciousness. These weren't living people. couldn't be living people, not dressed like that, not standing so still, not appearing and disappearing in the flickering light, as if their existence was somehow dependent on darkness and shadow. The tunnel's history came back to her suddenly, a story she'd heard years ago in school, half-remembered facts from a local history lesson that had seemed boring and irrelevant at the time. Kings Park Tunnel had been built originally as part of the railway system, but during World War II, during the Japanese occupation, it had served another purpose. Refugees had used it as shelter, hundreds or maybe thousands of people fleeing the bombs and chaos, seeking protection in the underground passages. But the tunnel hadn't saved them. Disease had spread in the cramped, airless conditions. Food had run out. Some stories said the entrances had been deliberately sealed, trapping people inside, though Sarah couldn't remember if that was documented fact or wartime rumor. What was certain was that many people had died there, in the darkness beneath Kowloon, their bodies eventually removed, but their suffering somehow remaining, soaked into the concrete and tiles like bloodstains that never quite wash clean. Sarah wanted to scream, but found she had no breath for it, her chest tight and her throat closed. The figures against the wall were moving now, not walking, but somehow shifting positions, some of them turning away to reveal backs covered in wounds, dark stains spreading across their clothing. Others reached out, their hands extending toward the cars in gestures that could have been pleading or accusation, impossible to tell which. A child was among them, Sarah realized with horror, a small figure clutched in the arms of a woman whose face held an expression of such profound grief that Sarah felt it like a physical blow. The child was motionless, head hanging at an angle that suggested death, and the woman just stood there holding the small body, frozen in her eternal mourning. Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears, the horror of it overwhelming every rational thought, every attempt to explain or deny what she was seeing. These were the dead, the victims of war and desperation and bad luck, and they were here, still here, trapped in the place where they'd suffered and died. Around her, Sarah could hear other car doors opening, other drivers getting out, their voices carrying through the cold air. Some were screaming, some were praying, some were just crying, all of them apparently seeing the same impossible things. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't make herself open her door and step out into that cold, death-soaked space. She sat frozen behind her steering wheel, watching as the figures multiplied, as more and more faces appeared in the darkness, pressing forward as if trying to communicate something, trying to make the living understand their suffering. A man appeared directly in front of Sarah's car, so close that his pale face filled her field of vision through the windshield. He was young, maybe Sarah's age, or a bit older, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held terrible knowledge. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged, just a darkness that seemed to go on forever, deeper than any human throat should be. His hands came up, pressing against the hood of Sarah's car, and she saw that his fingernails were torn and bloody, ripped away from fingertips that looked raw and infected. He'd been trying to dig, Sarah realized, trying to claw his way out of the tunnel when the exits were blocked, trying to scratch through stone and concrete with his bare hands. The knowledge of his final moments, of his desperate, futile attempt to escape, was somehow contained in his gaze, transferred to Sarah in that moment of connection across decades, and the boundary between life and death. The lights in the tunnel suddenly blazed back to full strength, brilliant and harsh, and the figures vanished as if they'd never existed. Sarah blinked against the sudden brightness, her eyes adjusting painfully, and found herself looking at an empty tunnel wall, just concrete and tiles with no marks or stains or crowds of desperate dead. The car ahead lurched forward, its engine apparently working again, and Sarah heard her own engine still running steadily as if it had never stopped. Her headlights were back to full brightness, her dashboard lit up with its usual array of glowing indicators. The radio crackled back to life, the same cantopop song picking up exactly where it had cut out, as if no time had passed at all. But Sarah's hands were still shaking, her breath still coming in short gasps. And when she looked in her rearview mirror, she could see other drivers standing beside their cars, some of them on their knees, some of them embracing, all of them clearly as shaken as she felt. Slowly, carefully, traffic began to move again. The car ahead crept forward, and Sarah forced her foot onto the accelerator, forced her trembling hands to guide her car through the final stretch of tunnel toward the blessed light of the exit. She emerged into the normal noise and brightness of Hong Kong at night, the city completely unchanged and unconcerned with what had just occurred beneath its streets. Sarah pulled over immediately, parking illegally on the side of the road, not caring about tickets or towing. She sat with her engine idling, her whole body shaking, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Around her, other cars were doing the same, pulling over wherever they could, drivers getting out to talk in clusters, comparing experiences, confirming that they'd all seen the same impossible things. Sarah couldn't join them, couldn't make herself leave the fragile safety of her car. She sat there for nearly an hour, slowly coming down from the terror, slowly accepting that what she'd witnessed had really happened and couldn't be explained away. Eventually, she drove home, going miles out of her way to avoid Kings Park Tunnel, taking surface streets that added 30 minutes to her commute, but felt infinitely safer. Her parents were asleep when she arrived, and Sarah was grateful for that, grateful not to have to explain her tear-stained face, or shaking hands, or the way she went immediately to the family shrine and lit incense with trembling fingers, praying to ancestors and gods she wasn't sure she believed in for protection and peace. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work, unable to face the normal routine of office life after what she'd experienced. She spent the day researching, finding article after article about Kings Park Tunnel's history, about the refugees who died there during the war, about the numerous ghost sightings reported over the years. The accounts were remarkably consistent, drivers describing electrical failures, cold spots, figures pressed against the walls, all of it matching what Sarah had witnessed. Some articles mentioned that the tunnel had been blessed multiple times by priests and monks from various traditions, but the manifestations continued, seemingly unable to be banished by ritual or prayer. One historian suggested that the sheer number of deaths, combined with the desperation and fear the victims had experienced, had created a kind of psychic impression, a recording of trauma that replayed under certain conditions. Another article, more skeptical, attempted to explain the sightings as mass hysteria combined with the tunnel's well-known history, people expecting to see ghosts and therefore interpreting normal shadows and reflections as supernatural phenomena. But Sarah knew what she'd seen, knew it had been real in whatever sense reality applied to the dead, and no skeptical explanation could dislodge that certainty. She talked to her grandmother that evening, finally able to articulate what had happened, and the old woman listened gravely, nodding at certain details as if they confirmed things she already knew. Her grandmother told her about making offerings, about respecting the dead, about understanding that some suffering was too great to be erased by time or progress, that Hong Kong's rapid development had built over countless tragedies without pausing to acknowledge them or allow proper mourning. The dead wanted to be remembered, her grandmother said, wanted their suffering recognized, wanted the living to understand what they'd endured. Sarah returned to work the next day, functioned normally on the surface while carrying the weight of what she'd seen like a stone in her chest. She never drove through Kings Park Tunnel again, altering her route permanently to avoid it, willing to accept the inconvenience if it meant never experiencing that terror again. But she thought about the dead often, about the young man with torn fingernails, about the woman holding her dead child, about all those desperate faces pressed against the tunnel walls. She started volunteering at a museum dedicated to Hong Kong's war history, helping to catalog artifacts and stories, feeling somehow that honoring the past was the least she could do. And on certain nights, when the city's noise died down to a manageable hum, Sarah would stand on her apartment balcony and look out toward Kowloon, toward the place where Kings Park Tunnel lay hidden beneath the streets. And she would think about the hundreds of souls still trapped there, still suffering, still hoping that someone would remember their names and their stories, that their deaths wouldn't be forgotten in the rush of Hong Kong's relentless present. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories may shake you, what lies ahead ventures into even stranger territory, where the dead don't simply haunt the places they died but seem to follow the living, appearing where they shouldn't be possible, pursuing purposes we can barely begin to understand. In the final part of today's journey, we'll discover that some ghosts don't wait to be found. They come looking for you, crossing boundaries between worlds in ways that defy not just logic, but the very nature of death itself. Lieutenant James Wong had been stationed at Sai Wan Battery for 3 weeks when he first heard the gunfire that wasn't there. It came in the middle of the night, sharp cracks that jolted him from sleep, close enough that they should have been inside the old fortress walls. He grabbed his torch and radio, heart hammering, and rushed outside expecting to find intruders or some kind of emergency. But the compound was silent, the other soldiers on night duty looking just as confused and alert, their weapons raised, eyes scanning the darkness. They searched for 20 minutes, checking every corner of the crumbling military installation, finding nothing but shadows and the wind moving through the abandoned gun emplacements. The duty sergeant filed a report, speculating about echoes from construction work happening somewhere in the area, sound carrying strangely through the hills. But James had grown up in Hong Kong, had heard plenty of construction noise in his 24 years, and what he'd heard wasn't that. It had been rifle fire, distinct and unmistakable, the kind of sound that gets drilled into your consciousness during military training until you can identify it instantly, even from deep sleep. The other soldiers seemed willing to accept the sergeant's explanation, eager to return to their bunks and forget the disturbance. But James found himself standing at the old observation post long after the search ended, looking out over the dark water of the harbor, wondering what he'd really heard and why it had sounded so close, so immediate, as if whoever fired those shots had been standing right beside him in the night. Sai Wan Battery sat on the northeastern tip of Hong Kong Island, a military installation that dated back to the early 20th century, when Hong Kong was still under British colonial rule. The battery had been designed to defend the harbor approaches, massive guns positioned to destroy any hostile ships attempting to enter. The fortress had been impressive in its day, with underground magazines, observation posts, and living quarters for the soldiers who manned the defenses. But by the time Japan invaded in December 1941, the installation's strategic value had already diminished, its guns outdated and poorly maintained, its position vulnerable to attacks from directions it hadn't been designed to defend against. The Japanese forces had landed on the Kowloon side and pushed south, overwhelming the vastly outnumbered British and Commonwealth defenders in a campaign that lasted barely 2 weeks. Sai Wan Battery had fallen quickly, the garrison unable to withstand the assault. What happened next had become one of the darker chapters in Hong Kong's wartime history, though the details remain disputed and incomplete in official records. The captured garrison had been executed. That much was documented, but the circumstances varied depending on which account you read. Some sources claim the soldiers had been killed immediately after surrender, lined up and shot on the battery grounds. Others suggested they'd been taken away, imprisoned, and killed later. A few historians argued that the deaths had occurred during the fighting itself, that there had been no separate massacre at all. The truth, as often happened with wartime atrocities, had been obscured by time and conflicting testimonies and the general chaos of war. What remained were the physical traces, the old fortress slowly decaying on its headland, and the stories that locals told about strange occurrences within its walls. James had heard some of those stories during his first week, other soldiers sharing tales over meals or during quiet moments on duty. Unexplained sounds were common, apparently not just gunfire, but voices speaking in Japanese or sometimes in English with British accents, orders barked by officers who'd been dead for more than 80 years. Some soldiers reported seeing figures in old-style uniforms, British khaki or Japanese military dress, standing near the gun emplacements or walking the perimeter paths. Objects moved on their own, doors that should have been locked were found open. Cold spots appeared in certain rooms even during Hong Kong's brutal summer heat. James had dismissed most of it as the kind of ghost stories soldiers always told, exaggerations meant to spook new arrivals or relieve boredom during long watches. He wasn't superstitious, had never believed in spirits or hauntings despite being raised by a grandmother who took such things very seriously. The modern military training he'd received emphasized discipline and rationality, left no room for supernatural explanations of unusual events. But 3 weeks into his posting, after his third night of hearing phantom gunfire, James was starting to question his certainty. The sounds came again 2 nights later, the same pattern of rifle shots, but this time James was already awake, standing watch at the northern observation point. He heard them clearly, 7 or 8 shots in quick succession, then a pause, then 3 more spaced out like someone taking careful aim. The sounds came from behind him, from deeper within the battery complex, near the old magazine where ammunition had once been stored. James turned slowly, his own weapon raised, and called out in Cantonese, identifying himself and demanding that whoever was there show themselves. Silence answered him, heavy and expectant, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the city far below. James activated his radio, calling for backup, then moved carefully toward the source of the sounds. The magazine entrance was a dark rectangle cut into the hillside, reinforced concrete that had weathered decades of neglect, but still stood solid. The heavy door was closed, secured with a modern padlock that the army had installed when they'd taken over the site for training exercises. James approached cautiously, checking the lock. Secure, undisturbed, no sign that anyone had tampered with it or forced entry. He swept his torch beam across the door and surrounding walls, finding nothing unusual, no footprints in the dirt, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The backup arrived, 2 other soldiers equally puzzled and alert, and together they unlocked the magazine and searched inside. The space was empty except for some old shelving units and scattered debris, certainly no weapons or any way to produce the sounds James had heard. They searched the entire compound after that, a thorough sweep that turned up nothing, and by the time they finished, James could see the skepticism in his companions' faces, the unspoken suggestion that maybe he'd imagined it or fallen asleep without realizing and dreamed the whole thing. But James knew what he'd heard, knew he'd been fully awake and alert, and the doubt in their eyes only made him more determined to understand what was happening. He started researching the battery's history in earnest, spending his off-duty hours in libraries and online, tracking down old military records and local historical accounts. The more he learned, the more disturbed he became. The massacre, if that's what it had been, seemed to have occurred near or possibly inside the magazine, the captured soldiers taken to the isolated spot and executed away from witnesses. The exact number of dead varied by source, anywhere from 20 to 50 men. Their bodies disposed of in ways that remained unclear. Some accounts mentioned a mass grave on the grounds. Others suggested the bodies had been thrown into the sea. None of the victims had been properly buried with military honors, their deaths not officially acknowledged until years after the war when testimonies began to surface. James found photographs of the battery from the war years, grainy black and white images showing young soldiers posing beside the massive guns, smiling despite the danger they faced. He studied their faces, trying to imagine what they'd felt in those final moments when the Japanese soldiers approached, whether they'd known what was coming or had hoped for mercy. The weight of that history seemed to press down on the battery itself, making even the daytime hours feel oppressive and sad. The manifestations intensified as James's posting continued. The gunfire became almost routine, occurring every few nights, always when James was on duty, as if targeting him specifically. But now there were other phenomena, too. Things that couldn't be dismissed as auditory hallucinations or misidentified sounds. Doors opened and closed on their own, the heavy metal fire door that led to the underground sections swinging wide with no one near it, then slamming shut with enough force to make the walls vibrate. Equipment malfunctioned, radios producing static that resolved briefly into voices speaking urgent words in languages James couldn't identify. Torches flickering and dying even with fresh batteries. The temperature in certain areas would drop precipitously, James's breath misting in the air despite the humid warmth of the Hong Kong night. Other soldiers began experiencing similar things, enough that it became an open topic of discussion despite the military's general disapproval of such talk. The commanding officer ordered a full inspection of the facility, looking for structural issues or electrical problems that might explain the disturbances. Engineers came and spent 2 days examining every system, every wire and pipe and seal, and found nothing wrong, everything functioning exactly as it should. The official explanation became stress and suggestion, the power of expectation creating shared hallucinations among soldiers who'd heard the ghost. Stories and let their imaginations run wild. But James knew better, could feel the difference between his own mind playing tricks and something external imposing itself on his perception. The presence at Sai Wan Battery was real, or as real as such things could be. Something that existed in the space between past and present, unable or unwilling to move on from the place where terrible violence had occurred. He started noticing the figures that other soldiers had mentioned, shadowy forms that appeared in peripheral vision, gone when you turned to look directly. They seemed to congregate near the old gun positions, standing at attention or moving through maintenance routines, phantom soldiers still performing duties that no longer had any purpose. James never saw them clearly, just impressions of movement and shape, human-sized presences that existed for a moment before dissolving into shadow. But once, just once, he saw something that couldn't be dismissed as peripheral vision tricks or light distortion. He'd been checking the perimeter fence near midnight when he noticed someone standing by gun number 3, one of the massive artillery pieces that still remained in place as historical artifacts. The figure was solid, clearly visible in the moonlight, wearing what looked like a British military uniform from the World War II era. James approached carefully, calling out, assuming it was a trespasser, or perhaps a historical reenactor who'd somehow gotten onto the military grounds. The figure didn't respond, didn't turn toward James's voice, just stood there looking out toward the harbor as if watching for approaching ships that would never come. James got within 10 feet before the figure turned, and in the moonlight he saw a face that made his blood freeze. It was young, probably younger than James himself, with features that suggested British or possibly Australian ancestry. The expression was calm, almost peaceful, but the eyes were wrong, dark and empty in a way that didn't match the rest of the face, like looking into wells that had no bottom. The figure's mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged, or rather the sound that came out was wrong, disconnected from the lip movements. Words in English, but overlapping and echoing, as if multiple voices were trying to speak through a single throat. James caught fragments, orders about gun positions and ammunition loads, technical terminology from another era, all of it delivered in that strange, multi-layered voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then the figure raised its hand, not in greeting but pointing, directing James's attention toward the magazine entrance. James turned to look, just for a second, and when he turned back, the figure was gone, the space beside the gun empty, as if no one had ever stood there. But the air was freezing cold, cold enough that frost had formed on the metal surface of the gun barrel, impossible in Hong Kong's climate, but undeniably present, white crystals glinting in the moonlight. James touched the frost with shaking fingers, felt its reality, watched it melt against his skin. He looked toward the magazine, toward the spot the figure had indicated, and felt a deep unwillingness to approach, a primal resistance to going near that dark entrance. But duty and curiosity warred with fear, and slowly James forced himself to walk toward the magazine, his torch beam cutting through the darkness, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The door was open. He saw, as he got closer, the padlock dangling uselessly from the hasp, though James knew it had been secured during the last perimeter check just an hour ago. The darkness beyond the entrance seemed absolute, swallowing his torch beam without reflecting any light back. James stood at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to turn around, to radio for backup, to not enter that space alone. But something pushed him forward, some need to understand, to confront whatever waited in that darkness. He stepped inside, his torch revealing the same empty space he'd seen during previous searches, nothing but concrete walls and scattered debris. But the cold was intense, painful against his exposed skin, and the silence was wrong, too complete, as if sound itself was being absorbed by something unseen. James moved deeper into the magazine, his torch beam sweeping across walls that seemed to shimmer slightly, as if viewed through heat distortion, except the air was freezing. Then he saw them. Dozens of figures pressed against the far wall, standing shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, all of them wearing British military uniforms, all of them staring directly at him with those same wrong, empty eyes. James tried to scream but found he had no air, his chest locked and his throat closed. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in their impossible formation, and James understood with terrible clarity that he was looking at the dead, at the men who'd been brought to this place and executed, at soldiers who'd died badly and been left unmourned, their suffering soaked into the concrete and earth and never acknowledged or resolved. James ran, abandoning dignity and military bearing, fleeing the magazine and the battery grounds entirely, not stopping until he'd reached the road and the reassuring presence of passing cars and artificial light. He stood there gasping, trying to collect himself, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The rational part of his mind offered explanations, stress-induced hallucinations, carbon monoxide exposure from some unknown source, some kind of neurological event that needed medical attention. But James knew those explanations were wrong. knew what he'd witnessed was real in whatever way reality applied to the dead. He'd seen the massacre victims, seen them trapped in the place where they died, unable to move on, still standing in formation as they'd been forced to do before the bullets tore through them. The thought made James sick, physically sick, and he bent over on the roadside and vomited, his body rejecting the knowledge his mind had been forced to accept. He couldn't go back, couldn't face another night in that place, knowing what waited there. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called his commanding officer, reported that he was ill, that he needed to be relieved immediately. The officer was annoyed, but agreed, sending a replacement and ordering James to report to the medical officer first thing in the morning. James waited by the road until the replacement arrived, briefed him as minimally as possible, then left without looking back at the battery. He never returned to Sai Wan for duty, claiming psychological distress and requesting transfer to any other posting. The military doctors examined him, found nothing physically wrong, and eventually granted his request, though his file was marked with notes about possible unfitness for certain types of duty. James didn't care, accepted the professional consequences without argument, grateful just to be away from that haunted place. He learned later that other soldiers had reported similar experiences, that the posting at Sai Wan had become unofficially known as difficult, that soldiers frequently requested transfers after short periods there. The military never officially acknowledged that anything unusual occurred at the battery, maintained the position that any strange experiences were subjective and explainable through natural causes. But James noticed that postings there tended to be brief, that soldiers were rotated through quickly rather than stationed long-term, that the facility was used more for storage than active operations, despite its strategic location. The ghosts, it seemed, had made the place functionally unusable, had reclaimed it from the living through their persistent presence. James thought about them often, about those young soldiers who died so far from home, whose bodies had never been properly recovered or honored. He started attending remembrance services, leaving offerings at war memorials, trying in small ways to acknowledge their sacrifice and perhaps give them some of the recognition they'd been denied. He didn't know if it helped, didn't know if the dead could be comforted by the actions of the living, but it felt necessary somehow, the least he could do. On the anniversary of Hong Kong's surrender, James returned to Sai Wan Battery one final time, not entering the grounds, but standing at the perimeter fence as the sun set. He said a prayer, something his grandmother had taught him years ago, words meant to guide lost spirits toward peace. He didn't see any figures, didn't hear any phantom gunfire, but as darkness fell, he felt something shift in the air, some subtle change in the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but James chose to believe that somewhere in the darkness, the soldiers of Sai Wan Battery had heard him, had understood that they were remembered, and perhaps that acknowledgement brought them a measure of the peace they'd been denied for so long. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.